Welcome to the Facilitators Deep Dive Podcast, your podcast on your way to facilitation mastery. We're tackling conflict today.
Oh, always a fun topic.
You know it. We've got Peter Conliffe's book, Conflict Management, a practical guide. So much good stuff in here.
Yeah, it's a great resource.
For sure. And I got to say, that statistic right at the beginning kind of blew my mind.
Which one?
Over a third of Australians experience, serious conflict every year. That's wild. It makes you wonder if it's just, baked into the culture down under.
It is a pretty striking number. It makes you realize how common conflict really is.
Yeah. I mean, we usually think of conflict as, a bad thing. But Condliffe actually says it can be positive.
Right. Think of it like friction. You need a little bit to get things moving.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Too much and you just get, sparks and damage.
Exactly. So the key is managing it well.
Okay. But how do we even know what kind of conflict we're dealing with?
Well, Condliffe talks about this idea from Burton, another expert. Yeah. He separates disputes from deeper conflicts.
Okay. So disputes are disagreements we can actually work through.
Yeah, through compromise, whose turn it is to do the dishes, that sort of thing.
Tell me about it. Dishes are the source of so much conflict in my house.
Right. Classic dispute. But then you have these other conflicts, the kind that get really deep, touch on those inherent human needs, as Condliffe puts it.
Yeah. Those ones that just feel heavier somehow.
Exactly. Like disagreements in families, at work, romantic relationships, they just feel different.
There's this whole other layer underneath, yeah.
And that layer, often it's about values, those core beliefs we have about the world. When those clash, finding common ground is tough.
Oh, for sure. It's not just about the surface stuff then.
Right. And Condliffe even mentions cognitive disputes, when people see the same facts but interpret them completely differently.
Wow. We're not even agreeing on reality itself.
Sometimes it feels that way.
Okay, so understanding the type of conflict is step one. But then how do we break it down? I mean, we've got values, but what else is there?
Condliffe talks about three main components. We've got values, interests, and then emotions, too.
Yeah, can't forget those emotions.
And what's interesting is the importance of each component. It can actually change depending on the conflict.
Really? Give me an example.
Okay, so picture a huge argument with your family. Emotions are running high, right?
Oh, definitely.
It's hard to think straight when you're angry or hurt. But then imagine a debate about something like climate change.
Okay.
Emotions might be there, but the core of that conflict, probably about different values.
Yeah, what people believe about the planet, the economy, the future, all that.
Exactly. So it's not just what we're arguing about, but also what's driving the conflict.
Whether it's a clash of values, different interests, or just a flood of emotions.
Exactly. And that shapes how we should approach the situation.
Makes sense. So then how do we approach it? What are our options?
Condliffe actually lays out 5 common responses: avoidance, compromise, competition, accommodation, and then collaboration.
Oh, so fight, flight, freeze, but with a couple extra choices.
Haha, pretty much. But the tricky part is there's no one right answer for every situation.
I figured. Sometimes avoiding conflict is best, right? For small stuff.
Exactly. You don't need a huge fight over what to have for dinner. But for those deeper conflicts, avoidance just makes it worse later on.
Oh, totally. Just kicks the can down the road.
And then competition, going all in to win. It can work sometimes, but it can also damage relationships if you do it too much.
So then collaboration is the ideal.
It often is, but it's definitely the hardest. Takes more time and effort.
For sure.
But Conliffe argues it's the best way to really resolve the conflict and keep those relationships healthy. He also talks about conflict systems design.
Oh, what's that?
Basically matching the conflict resolution process to the specific type of conflict you're dealing with.
So using the right tool for the job.
Exactly. You wouldn't use a hammer to fix a leaky faucet, right? Same idea with conflict.
Makes sense. But honestly, all this talk about conflict is making me want to just avoid everything.
Haha. I get it. But there's a trend Condliffe talks about that gives me hope.
Oh, what's that?
Over the last 30 years, Australia has seen this rise in alternative dispute resolution, ADR for short.
Okay. Is that just a fancy way of saying talking things out?
It is about communication, but it's more than that. It covers a bunch of processes like mediation, arbitration, stuff that helps people resolve conflict outside the court system.
Interesting. Why do you think Australia is moving towards that?
Well, Condliffe points to a few reasons, starting with this thing called the Australian Commercial Disputes Centre. It was established back in '86.
Yep.
And it basically showed that mediation could be super effective for commercial disputes, especially, avoiding those long court battles.
So it's more efficient.
Efficiency is part of it, yeah.
Yeah.
But ADR is also seen as fairer because it gives people more control over how the conflict gets resolved.
Right. And that ties into empowerment too, doesn't it?
Exactly. ADR lets individuals be part of finding the solution instead of just having a judge decide for them.
Yeah, that fits with that Aussie preference for informal processes. Less about courts and all that.
Definitely. It's part of a bigger cultural shift, people wanting conflict resolution that feels more accessible, more transparent, just more human.
I like that. So ADR is gaining ground. It's based on some good values.
Yeah.
But how does it actually work in real life? Like, how do we get better at having those tough conversations?
Well, in Chapter 3, Conliffe gets into the nitty-gritty of those difficult conversations.
Okay, good. Let's get practical.
And one of the first things he says is, you got to understand different communication styles. We don't all express ourselves the same way.
Oh, for sure. Some people are super direct. Others are more subtle.
Exactly. And those differences can cause misunderstandings. They can even make the conflict worse.
Yeah, if you're not speaking the same language, basically.
Right. And Conliffe talks about this idea from Cantor about these heroic modes of communication.
Heroic modes. Interesting.
Yeah. Have you ever noticed how when people feel threatened, they kind of fall into these predictable patterns?
Oh, totally. Some people turn into, like, fierce advocates for their side no matter what.
Exactly. Then you've got the prosecutors, always looking to blame someone. And don't forget the adjudicators.
Ah, yes, those who stay all detached and judge everyone else.
Yep. And while these reactions are understandable, they don't really help resolve the conflict.
So how do we avoid falling into those traps ourselves?
Conliffe's got some good advice. He talks about reflective listening, like really trying to understand the other person's view before jumping in with your own.
Okay. Seems simple enough, but I bet it's hard to actually do.
It takes practice. He also says to avoid interrupting and to keep the focus on the issue, not the person.
Right. Don't make it personal.
Exactly. It sounds basic, but those things can really help de-escalate a tense situation.
I can see that. And it's not just what we say, it's how we say it too.
Yeah, absolutely. Tone of voice, body language, facial expressions, they all send messages.
Oh, for sure. Like a big sigh can say more than any words.
Exactly. So being mindful of how we come across, especially when emotions are high, that's key.
Good reminder. That actually ties into something else we touched on earlier, mediation, right?
Oh yeah, mediation's a big one.
Right. Well, let's dive into that then.
Yeah, mediation, it's pretty cool actually.
I was actually curious about it. There are all sorts of different approaches, right? It seems like more than just sitting in a room and hashing things out.
Oh yeah, definitely. Condliffe breaks it down into different models. There's the facilitative approach, where the mediator mostly focuses on keeping the conversation going, making sure everyone gets heard.
Okay, so like a referee almost.
Kinda, yeah. But not about like making calls or anything, more about making sure everyone gets a fair chance to talk.
Right.
Then you've got the evaluative style, where the mediator actually weighs in with their own opinions, suggestions, based on their experience.
So in that case, the mediator's kind of like a judge, but a more informal one.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. They're not making a ruling, but they're bringing their expertise to the table.
Makes sense. So what's the other model? Transformative.
Right. That one's all about helping people really understand each other, come to their own solutions. It's about empowerment, like we talked about with ADR.
That one sounds really powerful, but maybe also trickier to pull off.
It definitely takes more work, more self-awareness from everyone involved.
For sure. You got to be willing to really see things from the other person's side.
Yeah, exactly. But Conliffe makes the case that it can be super effective, especially for those deep, complex conflicts where relationships really matter.
I can see that.
And he actually walks through the whole process step by step, from the initial contact all the way to reaching an agreement.
Even if I never actually become a mediator, knowing those steps could be helpful for just life in general.
Oh, yeah, totally. It's a framework for approaching those tough conversations, no matter what the context.
Right.
But there's one thing Conliffe emphasizes that I wanted to mention about the ethical side of mediation.
Oh, yeah, he's big on that. Impartiality, confidentiality, self-determination.
Exactly. Those principles are crucial for building trust, making sure everyone feels safe to share their perspective.
I mean, you wouldn't want to go to mediation thinking the mediator was biased, right?
No way. And you need to know that what you say will stay private.
Absolutely.
So those ethical guidelines are what make mediation really work.
Makes sense. Okay, so we've got communication styles, different ways to approach conflict, and now mediation. What else can we add to our conflict resolution toolkit?
Well, Conliffe goes into another approach that's especially relevant to criminal justice, restorative justice.
Yeah, I've heard of that, but to be honest, I'm not totally clear on what it is.
It's basically about focusing on repairing the harm that was done, rather than just punishment.
Okay, so less about retribution, more about finding a way forward.
Exactly. It acknowledges that crime affects not just the victim and offender, but the whole community. And it aims to bring everyone together to address the harm, hold the offender accountable, and work towards healing.
Interesting. So it's more holistic, looks at the bigger picture.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And Condliffe has this really powerful example, the story of Charles and
Oh
Regis.
yeah, that one was intense. But it showed how, even when there's been serious harm, there's still a chance for understanding, forgiveness.
Right. And ultimately, transformation for everyone involved.
It was really moving.
It really shows how restorative justice can lead to genuine healing.
Yeah. And those principles, repairing harm, accountability, including the victim, those can apply to all kinds of conflicts, not just crime.
Absolutely. It makes you think about those times when you've been hurt by someone and how focusing on punishment hasn't always brought closure.
Right. Sometimes it just makes things worse.
Exactly. Sometimes what you need is acknowledgement, understanding, a genuine effort to make things right.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we've covered personal conflicts, even criminal justice, but we spend a ton of time at work too. And let's face it, conflict happens there all the time.
Oh, for sure. And Conliffe has a whole chapter dedicated to conflict in organizations. He talks about how the structure of an organization, the power dynamics, even just the way people communicate can contribute to conflict.
So it's not always just about clashing personalities.
Right. Sometimes it's the systems that are messed up, like unclear roles and responsibilities or decisions being made behind closed doors.
Yeah, that breeds resentment for sure, if people don't know what's going on or feel like they're being left out.
Exactly. And Conliffe has some great tools for analyzing those workplace conflicts. He talks about this idea from Peter Senge about the learning organization. It's all about continuous learning, adaptation, seeing the organization as a whole system.
Okay, so not just putting out fires, but figuring out what's causing them in the first place.
Exactly. Shifting from reactive to proactive.
That sounds great in theory, but I imagine it's hard to change an entire organization's approach to conflict.
It's a big undertaking, for sure. But Conliffe outlines a process called Conflict Management System Design, or CMSD.
CMSD? Okay. Sounds pretty official.
It is a structured approach, yeah.
Yeah.
But it basically means having a plan for dealing with conflict before it even happens.
Like a playbook for conflict resolution.
Exactly. And it's tailored to the specific organization, its needs and challenges.
Interesting. So how does it work?
Well, first you analyze the types of conflict that tend to pop up. What are the recurring patterns? What are the things that trip people up?
Okay, so you're basically identifying the weak points.
Right. And once you know the patterns, you can design strategies to address those specific types of conflict.
Right, so it might be about clear policies or training people in conflict resolution skills.
Or creating a culture where people feel comfortable speaking up, sharing their concerns.
So it's not just about reacting to conflict, it's about preventing it as much as possible.
Exactly. And the last step is putting those strategies into action, then reviewing and refining them over time.
So it's an ongoing process, constantly adapting.
It has to be. Organizations are always changing, so the way you handle conflict has to evolve too.
That makes a lot of sense. So we've covered so much ground here, from personal communication to organizational systems. Is there, like, one big takeaway that stands out to you?
What strikes me most is how Conliffe emphasizes that conflict is normal. It's not something to be afraid of.
I like that. Instead of seeing it as a threat, we can see it as a chance to grow, learn, maybe even strengthen relationships.
Exactly. And the more we understand about conflict, the better we'll be at navigating it in a way that benefits everyone.
We've covered a lot of ground. Different approaches to conflict, communication styles, even how organizations can, build systems for dealing with it.
It's a lot to take in, for sure.
It is. But there's one piece I'm still kind of stuck on. How do we actually deal with those really tough emotional situations? It feels like sometimes our own feelings just get in the way.
Oh, absolutely. Emotions can be the biggest hurdle. And that's something Conliffe really gets into.
Okay, good. Because sometimes it feels like, you just got to push those emotions down and try to be rational.
It's tempting to do that, yeah. But Conliffe actually suggests thinking about emotions as a form of communication.
Interesting. So not ignoring them, but trying to understand what they're telling us.
Exactly. When you're feeling angry or hurt, it's a signal that something's wrong. Maybe your needs aren't being met, your values are being challenged, something like that.
Right, right. So those emotions are giving us information.
They are. They're valuable data points. And once we understand what those underlying needs or values are, we can start to address them.
Okay, that makes sense. But like knowing that in theory and actually doing it in the heat of the moment, those are two different things.
Oh, for sure. It takes practice. But Conliffe does offer some practical tips.
Lay 'em on me.
Well, we already talked about reflective listening, but he also emphasizes empathic validation. It's about communicating that you understand and respect the other person's feelings, even if you don't agree with them.
So like even if I think someone's overreacting, I should still acknowledge how they feel.
Exactly. It doesn't mean you're condoning their behavior, but it shows you're trying to understand where they're coming from.
Okay. That can help de-escalate things.
Right? And then there's reframing. It's about trying to see the situation from a different angle.
Ooh, yeah, reframing. That can be helpful when you're just stuck in the same argument going nowhere.
Totally. It helps you find common ground, shift the focus from attacking each other to actually solving the problem.
Makes sense. What else?
Conliffe also talks about assertive communication. Expressing your own needs and boundaries clearly, but respectfully. Not being aggressive or passive.
Finding that balance, basically.
Exactly. It's a skill for sure, but it's essential for navigating conflict well.
So what are some things to avoid doing?
Well, one thing Conliffe mentions is offering advice too soon. Sometimes people just need to vent, you know? They're not ready for solutions yet.
Right, right.
Another pitfall is diverting the conversation, like changing the subject when things get uncomfortable.
Oh, I'm guilty of that one.
It's tempting, but it just avoids the real issue. And then trying to have a logical argument when emotions are running high, that almost never works.
Yeah, it's like trying to reason with a volcano.
Exactly. Sometimes the best thing you can do is just listen, validate their experience, give them space to calm down.
Makes sense. But what about those people who just seem to, like, thrive on conflict, always complaining, always finding fault?
Yeah. Conliffe talks about vexatious litigants, but that's a very specific legal term.
Right, but I'm thinking more broadly, just people who are, I don't know, difficult for the sake of being difficult.
I know what you mean. And the point is, sometimes you're dealing with someone who isn't actually interested in resolving the conflict.
So how do you deal with that?
Well, Conliffe suggests setting very clear boundaries, like what are you willing to discuss, what's off limits, and documenting interactions can be important too.
Especially if you think it might escalate, yeah.
Exactly. You have a record of what happened. And don't be afraid to seek support from others, supervisors, colleagues, even legal counsel if you need to.
It's like, you don't have to just put up with bad behavior, right?
Exactly. Protecting yourself is important too. Okay, so to kind of wrap things up here, let's zoom out a bit. Remember that conflict management system design we talked about earlier?
CMSD, yeah. Creating a system for dealing with conflict before it even happens.
Right. It's about being proactive, not reactive. And Conliffe actually lays out a pretty clear process for doing that.
Okay, I'm all ears.
First, you got to analyze the types of conflict that commonly occur in the organization. What are the patterns? What are the things that trip people up?
So you're basically doing a conflict audit.
Haha. Yeah, something like that.
Yeah,
Once you know the patterns, you can start designing strategies to address those specific types of conflict.
right. So that might mean having clear policies, training people in conflict resolution skills, all that.
Exactly. And creating a culture where people feel comfortable speaking up, sharing their concerns. It's about preventing conflict as much as possible.
I like that. Proactive, not just reactive.
And the last step is actually putting those strategies into action, then reviewing and refining them over time.
So it's a living system, constantly evolving.
It has to be. Organizations are always changing, so the way you handle conflict needs to adapt too. Wow, we really covered a lot today.
We did. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of conflict and a bunch of new tools to use when things get tough.
That's great to hear. And remember, this is just the beginning. Keep learning, keep practicing those skills, and keep those communication lines open.
That's great advice. Thanks for taking this deep dive with me.
My pleasure.
See you next time on the Facilitators Deep Dive Podcast, your podcast on your way to facilitation mastery. Until next time.
See you then.